live at the waterhole. We're first up. We're at one of my favorite places at the Okokuyo waterhole in the Etosha National Park of Namibia. Lots and lots of elephants. That is fabulous. My name is Ralph Kirsten, and as per usual, please don't forget that this is a live and interactive experience, so we'd love for you to jump on board with us and send us through your questions and your comments. You can do that by going on the Wild Earth website and registering. You can also join the conversation on X, formerly known as Twitter, using the hashtag WildEarth as it appears on your screen. What is it that you'd like to see? What would you like to chat about? Whatever it is, wildlife related, send it on through. It seems like this big herd of elephants have already had their drink and cooled off, and looks like they're now making for the tree line off in the background there. Mopani woodlands dotted with acacias, or Vachilia as they're now called. But what a wonderful spectacle this is. The elephants have returned to this part of the reserve, and the animals are starting to concentrate around the waterholes as it gets drier going into winter. So this can be expected now on a daily basis. More and more animals around this waterhole. Fabulous. And it also looks like, once again, the east wind is blowing, typical around this time of the year as well. It definitely warms things up. So it does bode well for us because it will drive a lot more animals down for a drink. Lots and lots of zebra also dotted in with some springbok as well. I haven't seen too many kudu or black-faced impala just yet. I'm sure they're going to start trickling through as well. And of course, the animals wading into the water here to get to a little bit more of the fresher water, because with all the traffic along the fringes, it does muddy the water. And with the absence of crocodiles, they've got nothing to worry about in the water itself. They will be nervous, however, because there are a lot of lions around here, particularly the Ombika pride. And so they often do lie in ambush here near to this waterhole. I've seen in person a few kills right here at the waterhole. And once again, Mercedes Bean commenting, greetings, Ralph, Wild Crew and chatters. Happy Wednesday. Straight back at you, Mercedes Bean, and love you to have you on board once more. There will obviously be lots of separate harems within this bigger group of zebra. Generally, the harems are between 6 or 8. Sometimes they do get a bit bigger, but the bigger they get, the more the male has chance of losing his females to other males, stealing them for their own harems. And the name Okokuyo is Oshivambu for the place where the lady gives birth every year. And this used to be a natural spring, it still is, but it's kept permanent now with the additional underground water brought up to the surface. And very important, as one of these permanent water holes within the confines of the Etosha National Park, especially during the dry season. And that's why the animals all concentrate around these particular water holes. And Bundu saying, oh, brilliant, Etosha. Absolutely, indeed. Bundu, one of my favorite water holes of all time in the Great White Place. Just a bit of a closer look at all the stripes and the donkeys in pajamas. So Equius quagga birchali, the plains zebra, the most predominant zebra within the reserve. There is also the Hartman's mountain zebra, but found off mainly in the region of where we're looking at in the western side of the reserve. There's a big dolomite outcrop where they prefer to hang out. So you don't generally see them around in Etosha, just in the specific areas within the reserve itself. So, and as this time of the year rolls in, we'll have a constant flow of animals here during the day. It's a real festival of wildlife. See all those elephants off in the background, still just milling about, slowly heading towards the tree line. So I think I've done quite a bit of talking on the history of Etosha and all sorts of information. But for any new viewers, and I've found a new article or a blog on Conservation Namibia, speaking of the history of Etosha, as well as in particular the lions and the lion population of Etosha, which I think is very interesting. And they say that Etosha National Park is the best known protected area in Namibia and is part of nearly every tourist's must-see list when visiting the country. As with most parks in Africa, Etosha's history is bound up in colonial management styles and priorities. Decisions about how to manage it and where its boundaries were drawn were influenced by numerous factors that had little to do with biodiversity conservation. Future management decisions must take history into account while charting a way forward for this iconic protected area. And as the park's apex predators, lions have been monitored or at least noticed before monitoring was introduced over a large period of the park's history. Management decisions, particularly relating to fences and water points, have directly affected lion prey with some counterintuitive outcomes for lions. And attitudes towards lions have changed dramatically over this period, from vermin that they were shot on sight along the park's boundaries to one of Etosha's main tourist attractions. Meanwhile, lion-farmer conflict beyond the park boundaries has been a near constant feature for decades, and it continues through to today. So from Game Reserve number 2 to Etosha National Park. And while present-day Etosha National Park is an impressive 22,270 kilometers squared, the park was originally 4 times larger and went by the rather unimaginative name of Game Reserve number 2, declared by the German colonial government in 1907. And this huge reserve, the largest in the world at the time, incorporated the entire northern part of the Kunene region that was later known as the Kookeveld. In 1958, the western boundaries switched from north to south, now covering most of the southern Kunene region, or what came to be known as Damaraland. This new reserve was known as Etosha Game Park, that was managed by the proxy Southwest African government that ruled under the auspices of apartheid South Africa. The major boundary shifts in these early days mainly involved drawing lines on a map, as the park was still unfenced, and colonial policies aimed to reduce the number of people and livestock in the area in favor of wildlife. And the other related goal was to reduce disease transmission to livestock owned by white settlers living south of the park. So from the early 1900s to today, Etosha has undergone massive changes and ecological upheavals, yet the lion population in Etosha has been surprisingly resilient. Even though hundreds were shot on neighboring farms in the early and middle parts of the 20th century, the lowest recorded estimates of lion in Etosha of 150 was in 1952, reaching a zenith of 500 in 1980, while the most recent 2018 estimate is 335. The earlier lion estimates were based on the warden's knowledge of lion prides living in the more open savanna parts of the park and excluded the woodlands area to the west that were less accessible to park rangers. That's exactly the direction that we're looking in now, which was previously also closed to the general public. It was only local tour operators that were able to move through that part, but it's now been opened up. And the numbers reported in the different papers drew largely on the work of Control Warden Hugh Berry, who collated earlier reports and collected data himself to produce estimates covering nearly 70 years, from 1926 to 1994. And then Philip Stander, who is very famous for his lion monitoring work, in the 1980s included the woodland areas of the park for the first time, producing the most detailed picture of the whole Etosha lion population to be obtained either before or since. And several Etosha-based ecologists and independent researchers have carried out more recent but less intensive surveys to keep track of overall trends. While lions have been directly affected by changes in management policies over time, the greatest impacts on this population have been indirect. Diseases, fences, and artificial waterholes combined to devastate the lion's key prey species, the wildebeest and zebra. And the fences along the northern boundary of Etosha were particularly destructive as they blocked migration routes and prevented large herds of wildebeest and zebra from returning to Etosha. The remaining animals clustered around newly created artificial water points, which were subsequently used throughout the year and overgrazed. Gravel pits created for road building became small dams that would hold water for longer into the dry season than usual, thus creating more water points and setting the scene for the next disaster. Anthrax had always been a part of the Etosha system, but overgrazing and soil disturbance related to road building led to major outbreaks around this time. And due to these multiple stresses, the wildebeest population crashed from 25,000 or 30,000 to less than 5,000 within a decade, while zebra experienced a similar decline over a longer period. In the early years of this massive herbivore die-off, lions thrived. They are resistant to anthrax and could therefore feed on carcasses without harm. Creation of water points meant that their prey stayed in previously seasonal areas throughout the year, which allowed more prides to form stable territories in more parts of the park. With their two main prey species reduced to fractions of their former numbers, the now abundant Etosha lions were in trouble. Springbok, and to a lesser extent Gemsbok, saved them. In response to several good years, Springbok numbers tripled to an estimated 32,000 in the late 70s, thus extending the good times for the lions. But the lions' diets switched from 80% zebra and wildebeest in the 70s to 62% Springbok in the 80s. And the large numbers of lions were nonetheless a cause for concern for the remaining zebra and wildebeest. So they began to actually limit the lion population. And in the early 80s, severe drought struck Etosha and then the entire northwestern Namibia. The Springbok that had become the main prey species for lions now went into steep decline. And the lion populations followed from their all-time high of 500 in 1980 to 200 in 1986. Since then, lions have increased slightly and stabilized to around 300, between 300 and 400. Besides the ups and downs experienced within Etosha, there's been one continuous source of lion mortality since the very beginning: human-lion conflict. And during a 35-year period, 1975 to 2010, at least 1,059 lions were killed, mainly on freehold farms on the southern and eastern boundaries. And this reveals that the fences around Etosha serve as a hard barrier to lion prey, but not to lions that can still leave the park to prey on livestock and thus become vulnerable to farmer retaliation. So what can we learn from the history of lions in Etosha? This park has been a safe haven for a species that was all but exterminated on neighboring lands. Yet all but cutting this ecosystem off from the land around it has been devastating for lion prey species. There would be many more lions if wildebeest and zebra populations had never crashed. And although the lion population has stabilized over the last few years, monitoring remains important to allow us to continually evaluate management decisions. Extended drought periods related to climate change could pose another threat, so we cannot assume that the population will always be secure in Etosha. But the lions have nonetheless proven resilient by adapting their movements and prey preferences according to changes in the ecosystem. The socio-political landscape around Etosha has also changed dramatically. While the people living to the west of Etosha are no longer within the park, they have established communal conservancies that encourage mixed wildlife and livestock land use. Some of the freehold farms south of Etosha have switched from livestock to tourism, thus becoming increasingly lion-friendly. The much-debated park fence has not eliminated human-lion conflict beyond its boundaries, but it does prevent cattle from entering the park and thus becoming even more vulnerable to predation. As we discovered when the fence was first erected, the effects of fencing are myriad, and one should not take decisions about erecting or dismantling a fence lightly. But human attitudes towards lions remains highly variable, from damage-causing nightmare to one of the world's favorite big cats, depending on who you ask. Over the decades, conservationists have come to more fully appreciate the importance of factoring human needs and perspectives into the conservation equation. Etosha's lions will undoubtedly continue to be on the tourists' must-see list, but their future is firmly in the hands of Namibians, those entrusted to manage the park and those living next door. dropping the eyes are breaking up. So did you not hear me now when I spoke? It's always so interesting to watch the elephants as they communicate with each other. I love it. Sorry, I love it when they put their trunks up like that in almost a greeting pose. They sort of curl it up to the front, almost like a snake, but then the end of the trunk pointing straight forward. And very often when they greet each other, that's one of the first things that they do. Obviously, really smelling the air and fully understanding who the individual is that they're approaching, and then communicating with them. And they've now all huddled up. There's obviously lots going on here between them. You can obviously also see that big bull there standing head and shoulders above the rest of them. And quite easy to pick out a nice big bull in amongst a breeding herd. So GW saying welcome back, Ralph. Yes, GW, I was back yesterday as well, but I'll be doing the live at the waterhole the whole week this week. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens across all the different waterholes. But as per usual, here at Tau, lots and lots of elephants. And another individual here just coming in, sniffing on that scratching post. I thought he was going to stop and have a bit of a scratch himself. Looks like he thought about it, but he's just carried on. Maybe he's still going to. And there comes the dust in under the belly. It's also a favored sort of area that they do throw dust in. Also behind the ears and over the top of their heads. Also just having a toilet stop as well. So GW was asking, I believe they can consume 200 liters of water a day. How long can they survive in a drought? So GW, it's generally up to about 4 days because the elephants are actually heavily water dependent. But this is your average elephant. So we would also class these here in Madikwe slightly more average, although they do live in a semi-arid environment. So it could be a little bit more. I would say maybe up to 5 days at a push. But when we speak of how long can elephants survive without water, it would be amiss if we didn't talk about the desert elephants of Namibia, because it's the exact same species. So the world's largest terrestrial mammal is also famed for being notoriously water dependent, and these elephants being that. So the African savanna elephants in temperate rangelands drink water almost daily and love a mud bath and a splash as well to stay cool. Yet in northern Mali's Goma region and the vast Namib Desert, this fascinating pachyderm survives despite the low rainfall and intense heat. These herds, aptly named desert elephants, traverse long distances in brutal, arid environments with only seasonal rivers and scant vegetation for sustenance. And for years, ecologists actually thought desert-dwelling elephants were a separate species of Loxodonta africana, like the forest elephant found in the Congo River Basin's dense tropical rainforests. But the distinctive characteristics and unique social structure of desert-dwelling elephants are simply adaptations to the extreme temperatures in the rocky plains of northwest Namibia's Kunene region. So there's no genetic or physiological differences between elephants found across Namibia's wilderness or the African savanna elephant's continental rangeland, but the desert variety seems to look taller, and scientists attribute this long-legged illusion to its smaller body mass, the result of a lean diet of scattered grasses and shrubs. Desert-adapted elephants also appear to have bigger feet than those in more temperate landscapes because of their extended foot pads. The greater surface area stops the elephant from sinking into the landscape's iconic burnt orange sandy plains, crossing over dunes in search of food and water. And like their black rhino counterparts, also found in the Kunene region, desert elephants walk for hundreds of kilometers at a time. So studies have shown that Namibia's desert elephants have a remarkably straightened water intake. Female adult elephants and infants need water every 3 days. Males can go up to 5 days without water. Researchers describe desert elephants as opportunistic drinkers and have also observed that they use their trunks and legs to dig wells in dry river beds. I've seen this in person many, many times, even when they have access to surface water or man-made drinking pools. And signaling their ancient memory of water sources, even if they are below the ground, this unique habit also tells of their need to purify water before they drink it. But preferring to make their arduous journeys for food and water at night, desert elephants have also adjusted their feeding habits to make the most of the scarce resources. They'll forage continuously for a few days before resuming the trek across the rugged Kunene region, totaling over 115,000 square kilometers. Although elephant families are typically led by a matriarch and other female elephants, those dwelling in the harsh northwest exhibit a looser social structure. While scientists continue to investigate why they have noted that desert elephant family units are generally smaller than other continental populations, with fewer elephants per family, the herd is easier to feed, a much-needed survival tactic when food and water are days away in the harsh Namib Desert. So I always liken it to, in humans, the differences between Europeans, Africans, Eskimos, the Sherpas of the mountainous regions, so everybody adapted to a specific environment that they've lived in for, hundreds if not thousands of years. So Eskimos can obviously sustain much colder temperatures than your average person, and the Khoisan Bushman people of the Kalahari region would have been able to survive much hotter periods, and they also were said to have had an expandable stomach, so they could almost gorge themselves when there was time where there was food, and they could also survive longer without water. So we're all Homo sapiens, but very well adapted to our different environments. And those Sherpas, having a lot more white blood cells, they're able to survive in much lower oxygen-rich areas, and so that's what enables them to go to high altitudes without, having the devastating effects of altitude sickness, or at least a lot less of it. So I think it's all just down to the environment that creates the adaptations for the particular species within that particular area. Even though it's the same species, you will have them adapted. So if you had to take these elephants and put them into the Namib Desert, I think they'd do better than the Kruger elephants if you had to do the exact same. And if you had to take the desert elephants and put them into the Addo Elephant National Park, for instance, I think they would also struggle initially because it's so different to their normal harsh environment and it's so lush. But I think the Addo elephants would do worse going into the desert than the desert elephants coming to Addo, because I think just with so much water, I think they just find it paradise. Whereas the Addo elephants going to the desert, I don't think would last very long. Nice close up here of this one coming in for a drink, and maybe going to enjoy this lush green grass as well. Well, it's a lovely time spent here with these elephants at Tau, but I think it's time to change the place and let's head back to Etosha. With some more elephants coming in for a drink, and these guys obviously going right into the middle of the pond. A lovely cool off and a splash. This is wonderful. So Diane in the UK, welcome aboard once again, asking, I'm really interested in how they communicate. Do you think their rumbles make sentences, or are they like cat sounds meaning different things? I would think, Diane, that it might be a little bit of a mix of both, but a lot to do with specific noises, meaning specific things. And I'm not quite sure they actually do form sentences, but who knows with the intelligence that they do have. But according to Wildlife SOS, they say that trying to understand elephant communication and what each of their techniques implies. Now, it's pretty much an elephant orchestra. And they utilize an array of sounds to express their emotions. For instance, elephants roar to convey intimidation or distress, and they chirp and squeak to gather their herd or even to provide reassurance. Further, they make low-frequency rumbles to facilitate communication over vast expanses, and they use these sounds to vocalize affection or their dominance, form connections, seek a partner, provide comfort, or offer encouragement to one another. When they're highly stimulated, they like to trumpet as well. And the loud trumpet call indicates excitement, anger, playfulness, or surprise, as well as a sense of being lost. So, but that still doesn't get to the fact when we do speak of, and a lot of researchers and scientists also speak of the sharing of information of different waterholes and different feeding zones and paths that have been taken. So, I think it's quite difficult to actually analyze that. However, if we look at one of the most complex communicators alive, that being the honeybee, them and the ants, and these highly sociable invertebrates, they also communicate vast amounts of information literally by different movements and dances of their wings and the way that they move their body. And then the other individuals can form a picture or a map of where to go and find the most pollen from the scouts that have returned and then convey the message. So is it really necessary to form sentences? This is the question I'm asking, because if such, in inverted commas, simple creatures such as bees can convey such complex signals and messages to each other through simply movements of their body and dances, are we literally wasting time with all the sentences that we put through? I think in nature it's a little bit more simple. Maybe not so much emotion in the messages when they convey it, and maybe directly to the point. And another thing I think we also need to take into consideration is that potentially there's not the difference in language that we have as a bit of a boundary as humans, whether it's English, French, Spanish, Chinese, Russian, whatever it might be. If we come across somebody that's speaking that language, the message is difficult to get across. But with the elephants all speaking this sort of same language, and if it's a lot simpler, for instance, if we had to all return to Latin, I think we could convey messages to each other much easier than we do currently. And that's why, obviously, with the language of nature, we do utilize Latin, because it's a much easier and neutral language to utilize across the board. So I think scientists, researchers using language a little bit closer to what wildlife does in using Latin. So it's a point to ponder, but I think if everybody went on to Latin, we would, whether or not it's Latin or single global language, I think messages would be a lot better, and I don't think we'd have as much politics around the conversations we have. But it's very interesting indeed. It's always seriously amazing to watch as these elephants start returning en masse. It's been a few months now that this waterhole has been pretty dead. Um, so during the wet season, it literally is a huge contrast to the dry season because the animals just continuously roll through here in the dry season. But as soon as it starts raining, they all disappear. They disperse, and the elephants migrate off onto the eastern side of the reserve. And just to illustrate the point of simple communication a little bit further, when I first started out as a trails guide, well, once I was trained to walk with a rifle to be able to protect a group, because before that I was already walking in the Namib Desert with desert elephants and black rhinos for almost 10 years. Before I actually walked with a rifle. So I actually learned the other way around to walk without a rifle, and that's what I actually preferred. I don't like walking with a rifle because it puts it in the back of your head that you do have a rifle and you have a way out, especially with the guides that have never done it without. They walk with the bravado, which is subconscious, and that you will always be able to shoot your way out of danger. So anyway, that's not the point, but once we trained, we sort of learned that, in any kind of dangerous situation, you want to tell your group to not run. And initially, when I started saying this to my groups, if you're in a hairy situation, an elephant comes towards you, or there's a lion that charges or something like that, and you shout, "Don't run," to your group, very often the word that people hear is "run." And they sort of miss that "don't." And then you have chaos within the group, and you can actually have very dangerous situations arising as a result. So, post having had these couple of experiences with shouting "don't run" and people actually doing exactly what you're telling them not to, I changed that whole perception to say "stand still," and there was no "run" in it. So that was very effective in immobilizing the group and making them actually not run and stay still. But not mentioning "run" was actually a big part of it, I think. And so it just shows that sort of idea of keep it stupid simple. And I think very often the message is delivered much better when utilizing these kind of sort of reasoning. And I think elephants would have that kind of simple, stupid messaging and delivery of such that it's very easy to interpret and to implement and remember when they go on their travels. And, so can form a map of a very simple message that was delivered. That's just how I think. And I think the most natural way is to be as nature, and when you are in the wild, you couldn't be, closer to it. So I think the way that you start to think the longer you are in the wild is the way that you should be presenting yourself and delivering messages. It's not complicated. It's very simple, but it's also very brutal. But there's very often less complications than we think. But it's a complex subject to talk about as well. So you can actually start to see the heat waves rising off the calcrete rocks here. It does get very hot, very bright. It's almost like being in the snow sometimes in the Etosha National Park. Definitely need sunglasses, that's for sure. Looks like a big old bull, but he's got relatively small tusks. You don't really see Etosha elephants with massive tusks. They're huge elephants, some of the biggest in the world, and some contend that they are the biggest. I would concur. But their tusks don't do them justice. I think they're quite brittle. They don't have, I think they do lack a bit of minerals in their diet. So they do break and not get very long, like the ones especially in East Africa and in the Kruger area. The eastern side, or the eastern elephants, I would say, get much bigger tusks. But these elephants are still huge, and the biggest I've ever seen. So lone springbok, well, not lone anymore. There's another one arriving under that very iconic leadwood tree. So Lenny was saying you have the best stories ever, Ralph. Have you ever thought about writing a book? Lots of people have told me I should. I would have to delve into my archives in my brain and try to bring them all up, especially on these sort of 4x4 camping expeditions that I've done in Namibia. Lots and lots of stories to tell there. But yeah, it would be a nice idea, and maybe just a nice exercise to go through anyway, Lenny, but we'll see. Then from Sasha asking, does it ever get too hot in the Etosha area to go out on a drive? So Sasha, it does get well over 40 degrees, sometimes even past 45 degrees. The period I would say that is the most uncomfortable is that before the big rains arrive. So you have this building of the rain clouds in the periods of like November, December, and it can be extremely hot. So those are the periods. Luckily, when it starts now, it's actually quite cold in the morning. You'll actually go out with jersey on, sometimes scarf, even gloves. Depends on if you go in an open vehicle or in a closed vehicle. But then by lunchtime, it's mid-20s, if not into the 30s. So it's actually quite comfortable. It's just that period, like I say, November, December can be excruciatingly hot, especially if the rains come late. Then it can be. So middle of the day is almost out of the question. The animals are very lethargic because of it. So just like us, they'll either just come for a drink or be hanging out in the shade. So we tend to spend our time, depending on which camp we're at, Okukuyu, Namatoni, or Halali, which are the three main camps within the Etosha National Park. And they've all got lovely pools. I think Halali's got the biggest and the nicest. But lovely pools, lovely lawns, and so nice time spent over lunch, and then at the swimming pool, and then going out once it starts to get cooler again. And the animals will then also be starting to become active as well. So if we're super uncomfortable, well, you can think the animals will be too, and so they won't really be active. So sometimes, though, the distances are quite long in Etosha to get between the different waterholes. So you can start a little bit earlier, and once you're out there, and then it starts cooling down, and the animals start moving into the waterholes and becoming active, especially towards sunset. So we just play with those rhythms as well as guides, and don't really put people in too uncomfortable situations. But following the rhythms of the animals is a good idea, and then you will be able to see them a lot, and active as well. And then obviously important to get out as sunrise occurs, because that's when the gates open, and they've got clocks within the park itself at the gate, and so it shows time of sunrise and time of sunset. You're not allowed outside of those times, outside of the camp. So you may leave at sunrise and you must return at sunset. Well, I've returned many times after sunset because we've been in amazing sightings. So they know me very well in Etosha, and I always get reprimanded. But I do it for the sake of the guests and for sticking with awesome sightings. And so it's all in the name of getting the best sightings. But yeah, they do know me well for being late after sunset, and I'm always there exactly at sunrise when the gate opens. And lovely to watch them filing past here. This is just beautiful. I'll be putting on a show for all the guests as well at Okukuyu, because the platform is literally right below this camera where you can watch the animals, and relatively up close and personal. It's just an absolute spectacle. And that's why this waterhole is so famous, and this one elephant looks like he's going to go and give a bit of a show for the guests there. There is a wall, and there's also a fence at an angle towards the wall. They used to just have a wall, but there was a couple of German tourists that, well, I know of one, say a couple, but there was one German tourist that was sleeping on the bench. Folks often sit here and watch through the night. It is a spot-lit waterhole, so you can sit here and watch the predators coming in, the black rhino, and all the goings on through the night. It's amazing to watch. But he was sleeping on one of the benches, and the lions came over the wall and grabbed him and took him back, over the wall, and he disappeared. So once that tragedy occurred, they put a fence up as well to stop the lions from getting in. We once also had an incident at Halali camp, where it's also a raised area, and there's moringa trees right at the viewing platform itself. They also just got it because it's raised and it's in the rocks. They sort of did build a little wall But the elephants actually arrived at the waterhole when lions were there, and they chased the lions, and the lions jumped up onto the viewing platform. And obviously, the tourists that were there were running around like chickens with no heads. And so the lions were in camp, but there were no injuries or nothing bad happened. The rangers all obviously went through there as quickly as possible, and they tracked the lions, and they saw that they had actually found their way out. But if they can get out, they can get back in. Anyway, it's always just important when you're in the bush to have your wits about you and know what's going on around you as well at all times, because you never know when a lion might be chased into the camp by elephants, or if you're sleeping, you might get dragged into the park. So don't do one of those. It's quite strange. These elephants seem to like walking around the waterhole. Maybe they're after a particular path on the other side there. And the procession of the elephants, all in a line, it always makes for fantastic photography here as well. Now, there's one bull here. He seems a little bit irritated with himself. I wonder if he's coming into must. You can hear some more little blue wax bills, very high pitched whistle. Nice group of zebra also coming in now. I'm going to fill up the opposite bank there, looks like. Lovely and peaceful. Just imagine there are chalets that are right here near to the waterhole itself, and you've actually got the view over the waterhole. So just imagine sitting here on a daily basis and just watching as the procession of animals just come filing through. I had some guests there recently, and they absolutely loved it. Something really worthwhile doing. Is going to Etosha, and specifically at the waterhole chalets here at Okokuyo. Yeah, and also at this time of the day, nothing is rushed. It's a real waste of energy if you do that when it's particularly hot. So just expending as little amount of energy as possible to come down to the waterhole. They've probably got a long way to go to get back to food. So just very good at conserving their energy, especially the elephants. So Diane from the UK was saying, thank you, Ralph, for discussing communication. I'd forgotten bees and their ability to communicate with dance. And I think they use the buzz as well. Good to be given something to think about. Yeah, when we studied animal behavior or ethology, when I was doing wildlife management. That was our first subject, was around communication, and the dance of the bees as one of the most intricate communication systems, and perfect. Well, literally almost perfect. And so I think we've got a lot to learn from them, and especially when they can pinpoint over a number of kilometers, especially when you're the size of a bee, to another individual, and that one can go to the exact same spot that has been indicated by the scout. I think it's absolutely incredible. But I think it's a very simple communication system, as I've been saying, and I think sometimes simple is better, especially when you're trying to portray a message that's very important. So, I mean, we think of the systems that we had with Morse code, also very intricate messages could have been passed through there with that. So we're not, it is possible for us to pass simple messages, and I think sometimes when we complicate it, it really dilutes the message and confuses it. So I think in nature, there's a lot more clear, precise, simple messages than humans with our elaborate emotions and put all sorts of funny and fancy words into sentences, etc. It dilutes the message. Sometimes being straight to the point is the best way, and I think animals do that a lot. Then Busy Bee is saying, beautiful natural sounds from Okukuyu, filling my living room as I work from home. I love Wild Earth. Well, thanks very much, Busy Bee, and glad that you're enjoying the show and all the sights and sounds of the bush. So she was asking, Ralph, have you ever come across a deceased elephant? I've heard that other elephants will spend time with the bones, sniffing them and such. Yes, absolutely. I've come across many carcasses. Some I've actually been there when the elephant has been killed or is busy dying. And I've also come onto carcasses that have been there for some time. And what is very apparent is that there's a lot of interest from the living elephants when they come across a carcass like that. They spend lots of time there. And I think one that has always sat with me was once in the Uchab River, in one of the ephemeral rivers to the south of Etosha in Damaraland. We were on the tracks of Mama Africa's herd, a very well-known herd there. And she'd moved across into a particular area, and we'd been following the tracks for a couple of days. And we then came across this carcass, but it was an old carcass, and there, just a few bones remained. I think most of them had been pulled off and carried away by brown hyena and scavengers. But you could see that not only had the elephants come across that carcass and spent time there, you could see signs of them having done that on a regular basis. The tracks had literally flattened the entire area around the carcass, and it was also proud out in the sun. So it wasn't like it was in the shade and coincidental that the elephants were going into the shade and so spending time at this carcass. It was out in the sun, and you could see that prolonged periods of time the elephants had maintained and stuck around that carcass, obviously. And you could also see that the bones had been shifted with the movement in the sand. So they had not only been there, they had been touching it, sniffing it, and sticking around as well. So whether they were discussing with each other or if they were paying homage, I mean, it's difficult to interpret. But from the signs and the tracks, which never lie, it is obvious that they spend a lot of time around carcasses, whether it's out of curiosity, interest, or if it's actually sort of mourning the dead or respecting individuals that have passed. Who knows? Once again, we like to make emotional sort of and impart emotional ideas onto animals. Sometimes it's a little bit simpler than that, but I do think there is a real emotional state to elephants, and I think there's more to them than a lot of the other animals that won't particularly mourn their dead or spend time at a spot like that. So it's not the only time, because sometimes coincidence does definitely play a role in these kind of instances. But in that case, I've seen it many times at different carcasses, and the behavior seems to be the same, that they spend a lot of time there, they're paying respect, paying homage, and really touching and caressing the bones as well. So it's very interesting indeed. So I'm super happy that we spent lots of time here at Okokoyo today, because it's been a long time since we've had any prolonged period here at this waterhole, because it's been devoid of life just about, being in the rainy season. But now the animals are back, and this is the wildlife season in Etosha. So I'm stoked. So Nike Beck saying I would just sit there the whole day and work on my birding list. Absolutely, that's one of the things that I always say to the guests. Got onto this waterhole. You know what? Once we get back from game drive, take a bird book, take your binos, and take maybe another book just to read. But just sit here and check it out. We often have Corey bustards coming through for a drink as well. Every now and then you might see a secretary bird. There's lots of secretary birds in Etosha, and I think it's the place where I've seen the most Corey bustards and secretary birds anywhere in a national park. You see them all over these grassy plains. But also the sociable weavers, the largest nest builders in the world. The acacia-pied barbets, red-winged starlings, pale-winged starlings, and a lot of endemic birds here. Pale-chanting goshawks are some of the most common that you'll see as well. But a very big number of birds and a lot of endemic birds that we get here in Etosha. So you'd be able to add to, a lot of people add to their birding lists when they come here, that they have birds that they won't see anywhere else in the world. So once again, just very calm, very relaxed. Nobody doing anything very fast at all. Lots of milling about. You get that a lot at this waterhole because the distances between waterholes as well as to the feeding grounds is quite vast. So they do tend to spend quite a bit of time here. So, and Kendra saying, as always, thanks, Ralph, for hosting us. Yeah, it's heading towards the end of the show, and it's been wonderful once again, especially spending lots of time here at Okukuyu. I hope you've all enjoyed the show. As per usual, don't forget later on there's going to be the Sunset Safari, so don't go anywhere. Lots of action coming your way. As always, thanks to the wildlife for being the stars of the show. Thanks to you, the viewers, for joining us. And, of course, thanks to the whole Wild Earth team who make it all possible. It's been great. I'll be back again tomorrow, same time, same place. So I hope you all join me once again and have those questions and comments ready. Always makes for interesting chats. And it's always nice to get the questions through. It looks like this bull is just causing a little bit of problems. I'm wondering if he isn't in mast. Would make sense. Well, that's it from me for now, folks. Give it horns, bush greetings. Cheers for now.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the tent here. Welcome